This recipe is plant-based, but you're free to add any kind of meats or modifications that you want so that it can fit your family's needs. During mealtime, everyone's always looking for something healthy and quick to put together on the table. And using recipes as a guideline is a great way to make the process of cooking fun and interactive, and a learning experience basically for you, your family, or your students. And recipes provide an opportunity to teach and practice different levels of math as well as science. So I'm going to give you an example using one of my favorite cookbooks here. And the reason it's my favorite is because it has really pretty pictures. So as you can see, recipes are typically structured with a serving size or the amount of people that it serves at the top, as well as all of the different ingredients and the amounts that you need to prepare that. So what a great way for us to get our kids or our students engaged in like multiplication or division, or trying to figure out, well, if there are 2 people in my house, but this makes 4 servings, how can I cut that down to fit my family's needs? So I'm going to show you that using our recipe today. To do that, let's say this recipe calls for 1 cup of brown rice, and there are 2 people in my household. So how would I divide that? You would ask your kids like, well, how would we divide something like that? 4 divided by 2 is 2. So we're going to divide the entire recipe by 2. And to divide 1 cup in half, that's 1/2 cup. So you would just make those kind of adjustments as needed for your family. Another great thing you could do that might be a little bit more simple is doing some culinary math and trying to teach your kids about some conversions. So I do have a few cooking tutorials on YouTube. I just saw that question. So one example is, okay, this recipe calls for 1/2 cup of vegetable broth for the kale portion itself. Let's ask how many tablespoons of vegetable broth go into a 1/2 cup. So you would simply just take some vegetable broth and then measure out how many times you pour the tablespoons in to get to that 1/2 cup point. Now, I know that that answer is 8, so I'm just going to go ahead and move forward. But the great thing about this technique is if you do this with all of your recipes, you can then create a craft project with your kids or your students to make like a conversion chart that they can store on the fridge in the kitchen or even in the classroom so that everyone can use it in the future. Okay, so now let's start actually cooking. So I'm going to prep the onion and the garlic first for our recipe. And this kale stir fry is going to come together really quickly. So let me go ahead and start cutting. And I'm going to turn my heat on to low in a few minutes so that the oil can start heating up. So basically when I'm prepping an onion, I'm just cutting off both edges here, getting rid of the skin and all that stuff, like so. I'm just peeling off all those, peeling off all the skin, like that. Okay. I'm going to do this really quickly. So get rid of all that skin. And we're just going to slice this, okay? Go ahead and turn this stove on to medium so that it starts to heat up. And we're just going to slice it like this along the grain. So like if you can see the lines go up and down, we're just going to slice it along the grain so that we get nice, beautiful slices. Very simple. And we're going to use all this onion. We're going to start out by using 3/4 of the onion for the initial cooking, and then we're going to reserve 1/4 of the onion for the very end, okay? And we're going to do the same thing with the garlic. So this, I purchased garlic that's already peeled in a bag, And you can do that, or you can buy like the whole cloves, or you can substitute with those like jars of the minced garlic. That's a lot easier too if you just don't have time to be doing all of this. But I'm just gonna quickly slice all of this garlic like so. There's a lot of garlic, but I like a lot of garlic. So my mom always jokes that my favorite two ingredients to cook with are garlic and butter, which is true. I like both of those because they make everything taste great. Okay, so I'm gonna add a little bit of oil. The recipe calls for 4 tablespoons, so that's what I'm gonna do. Just pour a little bit, and you can use any kind of oil you've got at home. So this is just canola oil. You can use coconut oil or olive oil or grapeseed oil or whatever oil you have. Okay, so we're gonna let that oil heat up, and you know that it's hot when it basically moves a little bit faster than it did when you poured it in. So since I started preheating this pan, the oil should be relatively hot relatively soon. While we're waiting for that to heat up a little bit more, I'm gonna go ahead and prep the tomatoes. And all we're doing with the tomatoes, we're using 2 Romas, is we're gonna dice them up roughly. So cut it in half, cut it into 4 strips, turn it, and cut it again, like so. Okay, I think that oil is hot enough, so let's go ahead and start adding our onions and our garlic. Now, typically recipes will ask you to add the garlic a little bit later because you don't want it to burn, but I don't really mind that charred garlic flavor. Like I said, garlic is one of my favorite ingredients. So I'm gonna go ahead and add it now and let all that caramelization happen. And what that means is basically that the sugars in the vegetables are being heated to a temperature to cause browning. So that is why your onions will turn brown and get a little bit charred, which is building flavor. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and stir all that together. And at this point, the recipe calls for salt, pepper, onion powder, and garlic powder. But because we do have a seasoning blend that is like an all-purpose seasoning with all those ingredients included, I'm just gonna go ahead and use that for now. So that is this Taste Tutor Seasoning 101. So I'm gonna use that right now. So I'm just gonna sprinkle a little bit, whatever feels right. You can always add more, but you can't take it away. Let's finish cutting up our onions, or excuse me, our tomatoes. And one thing that's a healthy tidbit that I want to mention is when you're making foods that are especially plant-based and you're wanting to make sure you get all your nutrients, and you may have heard this in a previous session. I know there was one session talking about nutrient-dense foods. You want to make sure that you're eating a variety of colors because those colors indicate different antioxidants and nutrients that are used, that are beneficial for your body, but basically used for the plant to survive and stay healthy. And those things can also help you survive and stay healthy. So right now we've got 3 different colors going on. We're gonna add a 4th. So, you know, we got variety. Okay, so all our tomatoes are done. And as you can see, the onions are starting to wilt a little bit, starting to char a little bit and get brown. So we're gonna wait for that to cook down a little bit more. Okay, so let's move on to another wonderful educational technique. Let's talk about science. This recipe, I'm going to give you a very specific science experiment example, just because it is a vegetable recipe. But, and I'm going to turn this down just a little bit while I'm talking, but there are plenty of ways to incorporate science into cooking because basically all cooking is different reactions and sciences going on together to change your product from a raw state to a cooked state. So one thing we do offer is different baking examples for different age groups of kids. and giving them different science experiments and different science lessons, both virtually and in person when it's safe to do so. Just teaching them the different principles of ingredient interaction and stuff like that. For the cases of this recipe, we're going to be talking about color change in vegetables. For this experiment, we're just going to be doing like an observation and recording our results situation. So to start out with, we're looking at raw kale. And this kale I purchased, it was in a bag, already cut up and everything. So this is the 10 ounces of kale that the recipe calls for. But as you can see, the color is like a, kind of a dull green, like the regular color of regular kale would be raw. So you just want to like write that observation down, notice the color, and then we're going to go ahead and add our kale to our pan here and observe how this color changes. Okay. So you're going to do it in batches just because you're wanting to let the heat sort of break down some of those cell walls. And I'll explain what that is in a little bit, so that you can basically fit the greens in your pan. Okay. So we're just going to stir and try to get everything covered and then add another batch of kale. Okay. So at this point, it might be helpful to add some of that vegetable broth just to get it to wilt a little bit faster for the purposes of this experiment. So I can show you what I'm talking about. I'm pouring like half of it in there. And you know, like how you have a bigger pot and you know you should use a bigger pot, but then you end up using the small pan? I do that often. I feel like that's one of those cases here. But it's going to wilt down, so it'll be okay. And I don't know if you can start to see comparatively the kale that's starting to wilt versus the kale that's raw. You can see the color is a lot more vibrant on the kale that's starting to wilt. So it's been in the pan for about a minute or so, and we want to make sure we write down the observation of what the color looks like and how it changed. And this would be a great time to ask, whoever's cooking with you, your kids, your students, why do you think that happened? I wanted to talk you through just another example of how you can incorporate interactive learning through mealtime. And you can even have them help you put stuff in the pan or help you cut up the kale if you decide to buy it fresh. There's lots of ways to involve the whole family in the cooking process. Okay. So we've seen that the kale is a brighter green color. It's all in the pan now. So I'm going to go ahead and add the tomatoes as well. And the reason we're adding the tomatoes is because other than getting the nutrients, it's going to provide a little bit of a sauce once those tomatoes cook down for our stir fry, because we're going to be eating this with rice. So we want to have a little bit of a sauce to go with it, okay? So we'll go ahead and add our tomatoes and let that wilt down some more. And we're wanting to observe the color even further into the cooking process. So the recipe calls for this to cook down for another 5 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and add the remainder of the seasoning because I feel like because we added so much kale, that wasn't really enough. And I'm going to add the remainder of the vegetable broth. And you're welcome to use chicken broth with this as well, whatever you've got at home. Really, the point is to create healthy recipes with the resources that you have available to you in a quick and easy way. So make modifications as necessary. And like I said in the beginning, recipes are just guidelines. So if you don't like a particular ingredient, like this original recipe, I created with mushrooms, but I don't necessarily like mushrooms. So I know that since I'm going to be eating a majority of this, I'm not putting them in there. So you can change the recipe however you'd like. So I'm turning the heat back up because I want that to sizzle a little bit more. Okay, so we've seen all the kale is wilting. It's like that vibrant green color, but some of the kale that's been in the pan a little bit longer is starting to get really dark. So let's try to pull out some examples just to show you. And the reason I'm wearing gloves is so that I could do this and show you in a sanitary way. So you can see that this is the kale that's been in for about a minute or two. This is the kale that's been in for about 3, 4, 5 minutes even. And you can see the color change. So you want to make sure you observe those and also write down how is the texture change between this version and this version. And what do you think the heat is doing to make this kale turn into this like wilted version of the kale, okay? So the vegetable broth is starting to sizzle and we're gonna be cooking down our kale so that it's a little bit more tender. Kale is a hardier leaf, not as hardy as like a collard green or something like that, but you still want to cook it long enough so that it has a tender bite to it. Unless you're my mom, because my mom really loves crunchy vegetables, so she would probably be done at this point. But we're gonna cook it a little bit further so that we have nice tender kale. And this is almost done really. So the last thing I'm gonna do once this cooks down some more is add some more onion. I forgot to save a fourth, so I'm just gonna use another piece of onion and slice it like so. And that's what I'm gonna add in the end. Okay. So we've got our kale going. Now let's move on and talk about our brown rice and our beans. So we're gonna use both of those ingredients to make a garlic fried rice. And I'm gonna push this pan to the back and then move this over so that you can see what I'm doing. Now I've already pre-cooked my brown rice with the recipe that's available for download. And for brown rice, it's just 2 parts of the liquid and 1 part of the rice. For white rice, it's a little bit different, but I've included those measurements at the very bottom in the tip section. So I've already pre-cooked this just because it does take a little bit longer to prepare than a white rice. So I'm gonna set that aside. I'm gonna go ahead and turn this pan on to high and add a little bit of that canola oil again, or whatever oil you have at home to use. Okay. And I'm gonna let that heat up. I've already got my garlic minced for this particular portion of the recipe, and this is 8 cloves of garlic. And again, you can replace it with that already minced garlic from the store, okay? I've also already got my black beans rinsed and drained. You can use whatever beans you like. I like the low sodium versions of whatever bean. Today I'm just using black beans. Go ahead and add my garlic. So what you're wanting to do with this garlic, the oil's still heating up, is infuse the oil with that garlic flavor. So you're just frying it just a little bit, not enough to burn it, just to get that oil flavor mixed in there, okay? And while that's happening, I'm gonna go ahead and add my raw onions to my thing here. And again, we're doing that just because we want to add some freshness back. So that's pretty much done. And I'm gonna turn that heat off until our rice is ready. And it comes together rather quickly. So our rice or our garlic is nicely fried. So let's go ahead and add our rice. And again, we're just wanting to add a little bit of flavor, and we're not adding any seasoning to this because we cooked the rice in vegetable broth. So that's gonna give us just a little bit of salt. And we've already got enough seasoning in the kale stir fry, which is paired with it. So we should be good on the seasoning. And all we're doing is coating this with the oil just to get it nice and coated and toasted, like so. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add my beans, like so, and toss those in there as well. So the reason why we're doing this for this particular recipe is because we're not adding any meat. We want to make sure we're getting complete protein. And all that means is that we're getting all the components that make up a protein. So those are called amino acids. And basically those are the pieces that make the protein work properly in your body. That's a very simple explanation for that. But that's why it's important to make sure you pair things like the examples I gave earlier. So that's pretty much done. We've got some toasted rice, the beans, everything's coated with the garlic. So we're gonna turn that off. And while I'm plating, I'm gonna give you the results of our experiment with the kale. Okay, so the reason why our kale initially turned from that dull green to a bright green is because basically vegetables and plants are structured kind of like a brick house would be, or kind of like how the backsplash is. So they're just cells next to each other, and they give it that rigidity and that like crunch that you would get if you eat a raw vegetable. So in between all of those cells, there are air bubbles, and those air bubbles are basically blocking the view of the chlorophyll, which is what the pigment that causes the green color in those vegetables is called. So once you add heat to that, you're basically popping those bubbles, so you have a very clear view of all the chlorophyll in all of its glory. So that's why it's a brighter green. Now, typically, if you wanted your vegetables to stay green like that, you would just shock them in cold water so that it stops the cooking, and that will result in that bright green flavor that you get like when you're wanting to then go ahead and roast your broccoli or put it on a vegetable tray or something like that, or any kind of, vegetable that you want to remain vibrant green color. Now, when you continue to cook any green vegetable, that chlorophyll is damaged by continued heating, which is why you would shock it with the ice water in normal circumstances. But since we're just cooking it and we want our kale to be tender, we had to keep cooking it. And so that's why our color turned to a duller green, or a darker green rather. Heating also breaks down those cell walls that I was telling you about. So rather than having a, structure and a rigid leaf, you have these very soft and tender leaves like this. Okay. So that's basically why that happens. But that was really just giving you an example of how you can really apply any kind of science education to any recipe that you're working with, as well as any math education to any recipe you're working with. So it's really, being creative and doing a little bit of research, maybe getting in touch with your teachers or instructors to help you through that. You can also give us a call or a text or anything like that, and contact us on thetastetutor.com. So that concludes my demo. Bye, thank you.